Hi folks, James here from Sweet Pea Machine Embroidery. We started 2022 with our most popular sew-along design to date. It was the amazing bookshelf quilt. The Sweet Pea community had an absolute blast in January, with thousands of our amazing community giving this project a go. And we saw some jaw-dropping quilts. So, because you love making this style of quilt so much, we have been working hard behind the scenes on something very special. It is now the month of August, and Sweet Pea has a brand new quilt design for you all to make. Introducing the Sweet Pea Patisserie Quilt. This time, instead of a bookshelf, we are looking through the window of a fancy patisserie filled with tasty treats. You will have the same ability for customization and creativity with this quilt as you did with the bookshelf quilt. So it's very exciting, and we can't wait to see what you all do with your quilts. This is a video tutorial on the Sweet Pea Patisserie Quilt. We recommend you follow our photograph written instructions in conjunction with this video tutorial. Make sure you go check out the August Sew-Along group on Facebook to receive a 30% discount on this quilt. The link will be in the description below. If you found this video tutorial helpful, please like and subscribe. And make sure to share this video with all your friends because we want to get as many people making this quilt as possible. Enjoy the video.
Alright, let's get into it. First, I will show you the stitch out of the celebration cake block. Begin by hooping up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Place batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch the batting down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the batting about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Stitch the placement line for the background. Place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line, and stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Using the bottom trimmed edge of fabric A as a placement line, place fabric B wrong side up, crossing the placement line by 1/4 inch, with the excess fabric towards the top of the hoop, and stitch down. Fold the fabric over, hold taut and stitch down. Trim, leaving the fabric in the seams. Embroider the frill detail at the top of the block. Using the right trimmed edge of fabric A as a placement line, place one piece of fabric C wrong side up, crossing the placement line by 1/4 inch, with the excess fabric towards the left of the hoop, and stitch down. Fold the fabric over, hold taut and stitch down. Repeat the flip and fold process for the left window pane using the other piece of fabric C. Repeat the applique process for the bottom tier of the cake using fabric D. And trim. Repeat the applique process for the top tier of the cake using fabric E. Trim. Embroider the satin stitch around the bottom tier of the cake, and then the satin stitch around the top tier of the cake. Embroider the plate under the cake. Embroider the icing on the bottom tier of the cake. Embroider the candlesticks and then the flames. Embroider the icing along the top of the cake. You have now completed the stitch out of the celebration cake block. Remove from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch. Hold aside until all your blocks are made. Awesome. Let's move on to the jar block now. Repeat the exact same steps until you reach step 12. And just a quick reminder to follow the photograph written instructions in conjunction with this video tutorial. Now, embroider the cookies in the left jar. Embroider the inside of the macaroons in the right jar, then embroider the outside of the macaroons. We decided to use mylar on our block. This step is optional. Stitch the placement line for the left jar. Place mylar 1 on top of the placement line and stitch down. Do not trim yet. Embroider the left jar. Trim after step 17. Stitch the placement line for the right jar. Place mylar 2 on top of the placement line and stitch down. Do not trim yet. Embroider the right jar. Trim after step 20. You have now completed the stitch out of the celebration cake block. Remove from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch. Hold aside until all your blocks are made. Once you have completed stitching out all your blocks, first give yourself a pat on the back, and then lay out your blocks on a flat surface and decide on your layout. Start off by joining the blocks in rows. Place the first 2 blocks right sides together. Then pin along the bottom edge, matching up your border seams the best you can. We find matching up the 2 corner points works best. Take your time with this process. Now take your block over to your machine and stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right side later. Continue this until you have joined the remaining blocks in that row together. Open out the stitch seams and iron flat. Continue this until you have each horizontal row of blocks joined. Next, join the horizontal rows to each other by placing the first two rows right sides together. Then pin along the bottom edge, matching up your border seams the best you can. Now stitch the seams on your sewing machine. Stitch just inside the border already stitched on the blocks, so the stitching will not be seen on the right side later. Open out the stitch seams and iron them flat. Continue this until you have joined all the horizontal rows together. Adding borders around your quilt is optional. Refer to the Working Out Fabric Requirements section to work out how much fabric is required to make your borders. Skip this section if you don't wish to have borders. We made our borders 8 cm 3 inches wide. If needed, trim the edges to make them even. Measure one side of the quilt. Cut 2 strips of border fabric the length you just measured. We made our borders 8 cm 3 inches wide. Cut 2 pieces of batting to match. Next, we're going to secure the batting to the border fabric. This can be done in 2 ways. The first option is to place the border fabric right side up on top of the batting, and with the long basting stitch, so 1/4 inch from the edge. Basting the long edges together will prevent them from moving. Use a bobbin thread that will stand out for this step. The second option is to lightly spray temporary adhesive to the batting and lay your fabric right side up on the batting. Place the quilt on top of the border fabric with the attached batting. Right sides together. Pin together. Stitch together with a 1/2 inch seam. Pinning and stitching on the wrong side means you can make sure you're stitching inside the border line on the front. This will ensure this line of stitching will not show on the front. If you use basting stitches on your borders, go ahead and remove them now. Trim back the batting from the seam allowance. Fold over and iron the border down neatly. Optional, top stitch the border for a neat flat finish. Repeat for the opposite border. If needed, trim the borders to make them even. Now measure one of the side edges without a border, including the new border width in your measurement. Cut 2 strips of border fabric the length you just measured. Then cut 2 pieces of batting to match. Repeat the basting stitch method or use the temporary adhesive spray that we did for the first 2 borders. Place the quilt on top of the border fabric with the attached batting, right sides together. Pin and stitch a 1/2 inch seam from the edge. If you use basting stitches on your borders, go ahead and remove them now. Trim back the batting from the seam allowance. Fold over and iron the side border down neatly. top stitch the border for a neat flat finish. Repeat for the opposite border. If needed, trim the borders to make them even. Adding the backing. Place your backing fabric wrong side up on top of your work surface. Then place the quilt you have just made right side up on top of the backing fabric, wrong sides together. Lightly spray your backing down to your quilt to stay in place while attaching the binding. Place safety pins approximately 4 inches apart across the whole front of the quilt, going through all layers. This will keep all layers together while you stitch in the ditch. To join the backing, stitch in the ditch along the border seams and all the internal seams. Once this is done, trim the excess backing fabric so it matches the exact same shape of the quilt. Prepare the binding. Use your own preferred way of adding the binding to the outer edges of your quilt, or follow our method of making a binding. To make the binding, measure the length and width of the quilt and add them together, and then multiply by 2. Cut a long strip of fabric this length. If you're cutting one piece of fabric this length, add about an extra 12 to 16 inches, 30 to 40 centimeters to the length, just to be sure you have enough fabric in the end. Or cut a few strips and join them together with your sewing machine as shown. Add extra length if you're joining strips, about 4 inches, 10 centimeters per strip. The width is optional, but we usually find 3 inches, 8 centimeters wide sufficient. Lay the ends of your fabric strips right sides together at a right angle. Pin the 2 pieces of fabric together, keeping the edges matching. Draw a 45-degree angle with a fabric marker. Then sew a diagonal seam from corner to corner. Cut the corner a 1/4 inch from the stitch down. Now iron open the seam and repeat until all the binding strips are sewn together into one long strip. Then fold the whole strip in half, wrong sides together, and iron down. Lay out your binding fabric and unfold one end. Fold that open end of the binding to a 45-degree angle as shown, and lightly press. Trim your fabric a 1/4 inch from the 45-degree angle fold. Fold the binding strip in half again as shown. Match the raw edges of the quilt and the binding to the desired starting location, with your quilt right side up. Start about halfway along one side. Using a ruler, mark 1 inch down from the end of the strip. Mark with a pin. Using a ruler, mark 3 inches down from the 1 inch mark. Mark with a second pin. At this time, we also marked a 2-inch gap above from the first pin. This pin will signal when to stop stitching once we have sewn around the wall hanging. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch 1 inch of the open fold onto the wall hanging and stop stitching when you get to the 1 inch mark. Then leave a 3-inch gap. This will provide an opening to insert the end of the binding fabric when we have completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at the 3-inch mark. Continue sewing until you reach the first corner and stop stitching 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter from the end. But keep your needle down. Lift your foot and turn your quilt with your needle still down. Continue stitching to the corner. Lift the binding strip over and pull against that angled stitch that we just made to form a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip back down, creating a fold at the top. Pin and start stitching again until you reach the side of the quilt that you started on, mitering the corners as you go. Stop stitching when you get to the pin that marks the 2 inches from the starting point. Fold up the remaining binding so it sits just above the first 3-inch mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. Trim 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 centimeters off the raw edge of the binding for a good 1 inch, 2 to 3 centimeters. Place the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the start of the binding process. Pin in place. Continue to stitch the seam until the binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Now turn the quilt over so you're working on the back of the quilt. We started at the corners of the quilt. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron well. Pin in place. This will help get a nice pointed corner. Repeat for the other side of the corner, meeting up with the first fold, creating a nice pointed corner. Repeat for all four corners of the quilt. Then continue folding and pinning the remaining binding to the back of the quilt. Just past the stitching, once folded, iron well. Start stitching anywhere on the quilt from the front using the stitch and the ditch method. When you get to the corner, simply just leave your needle down and lift the foot and rotate the quilt. Put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you're right around the quilt. Give your work a press with the iron to finish it off. Enjoy your quilt. Well, there we have it, the sweet Pea Patisserie Quilt. I hope you found this video helpful. I'll let you on a little secret. I can't wait to see all your finished projects on the August Sew Along group. So please remember to post a photo. The link will be in the description below. I've had a blast making this video, and I hope you enjoy making the sweet Pea Patisserie Quilt. That's all from me this month. If you would like to see more beautiful quilt designs like this one, check out our online store, sweetpea.com. That's SWPEA.com. See you next month.